Welcome to FearBound Stories. Please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now let's begin. I had driven past this gas station hundreds of times before, usually without stopping, because it sat too far off the main highway and always felt wrong somehow. That night, my fuel light came on faster related to the rain and heavy wind, so I didn't think twice before pulling in at 2:17 a.m. The gas station looked ordinary from a distance, with fluorescent lights buzzing above cracked concrete and a small convenience store standing beside two lonely fuel pumps. What immediately caught my attention was how quiet it was. No traffic noise, no insects, not even the hum of nearby power lines. Only the steady rain tapping against my windshield. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting harder than expected, and began fueling at pump 2. Through the wide glass windows of the store, I could see a man standing behind the counter. He was tall, thin, and dressed in a faded station uniform that looked decades old. His head was tilted downward, as if reading something on the counter. The lights inside the store flickered occasionally, but he remained perfectly still. Once the tank was full, I walked toward the entrance. As I pushed the door open, a small bell rang overhead. The sound echoed strangely, lingering longer than it should have. The smell inside the store was stale, like dust and old oil. The man behind the counter looked up slowly. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes dark and glassy, as if he hadn't slept in years. He nodded once, silently, without speaking. I grabbed a bottle of water and placed it on the counter. The screen on the register turned on by itself, displaying numbers I didn't recognize before switching back to a normal price. "You're out late," the clerk said quietly, his voice flat and distant. I nodded and paid without saying much. He handed me a receipt, his fingers colder than expected when they brushed mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I noticed something strange. Behind him, where security monitors should have been, there was only a blank wall. No cameras, no screens, just peeling paint. I left the store quickly, feeling uneasy, and got back into my car. As I started the engine, I glanced toward the building again. The clerk was still standing behind the counter, staring straight at me through the glass, never blinking. I pulled out of the lot and merged back onto the road, relieved to leave the place behind. About 10 minutes later, I reached for the receipt to toss it away and noticed the time printed on it. According to the receipt, I had checked out at 3:02 a.m. The dashboard clock read 2:29. I told myself it was a glitch, a misprint, something explainable. Still, my hands tightened on the steering wheel as the rain grew heavier. Another few minutes passed when my phone buzzed. There was no signal for calls, yet a notification appeared from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence: "You shouldn't have left." A chill ran through me. I looked into my rearview mirror and felt my breath catch in my throat. In the darkness behind me, the gas station lights glowed faintly through the rain, impossibly close, as if it had followed me down the road. I accelerated. The harder I drove, the closer the light seemed to get. My radio crackled to life without warning, and the same flat voice from the station came through the speakers, calm and unhurried. "The night shift isn't over," the voice said. "Someone still has to stay." The lights behind me suddenly cut out, plunging the road into darkness. My radio went silent. My phone shut off completely. When I finally gathered the courage to look back again, the road behind me was empty. I never stopped at that gas station again. Later, out of curiosity, I searched for it online. According to old records and forgotten news articles, it had closed after a fire more than 20 years ago. The clerk working the night shift had never been found. The strangest part is this. Every now and then, when I drive at night and my fuel light flickers on, I see a familiar glow in the distance and feel my car slowly ease off the accelerator on its own, as if remembering a place where the night never ends and the clerk is still waiting for someone to replace him. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It was close to 2:40 a.m. when I spotted the gas station, its lights glowing weakly through the fog like something struggling to stay awake. The highway had been empty for nearly an hour, just my headlights cutting through the darkness, and I was already running low on fuel, so I slowed down and turned off the road without hesitation. The place looked old, but still operating, with a cracked concrete forecourt, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a single pump standing slightly crooked as if it had been nudged one too many times by careless drivers. As I stepped out of my car, the air felt colder than it had on the road, heavy and damp, carrying the faint smell of gasoline and wet pavement. Something struck me as odd almost immediately. There were no sounds except the low hum of the lights above me. No distant traffic, no insects, not even wind in the trees. It felt like the world had paused the moment I pulled in. I glanced toward the small convenience store attached to the station and noticed the door was open, the inside dimly lit by a yellow glow that flickered slightly, as if the power couldn't quite decide whether to stay on. While the pump clicked softly as it began filling my tank, I saw movement inside the store. A man stood behind the counter, tall and thin, his figure barely distinguishable through the dusty glass. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, facing straight ahead. For a moment I wondered if he was even real or just a reflection. But when I shifted my weight, he slowly lifted his head and looked directly at me. The unsettling part wasn't his stare. It was how long he held it, unblinking, like he hadn't looked away from anyone in years. When the pump finished, the sudden clunk echoed louder than it should have, making me flinch. I replaced the nozzle and forced myself toward the store, telling myself I was overreacting, that it was just late and I was tired. The bell above the door chimed weakly as I stepped inside. The shelves were half empty, stocked with outdated snacks, dusty bottles, and brands I hadn't seen since I was a kid. The man behind the counter didn't greet me. He didn't even blink. Up close, his face looked pale and drawn, his eyes sunken as if he hadn't slept in days, or longer. I told him how much fuel I'd pumped, my voice sounding too loud in the cramped store. He slowly looked down, tapped a few keys on the register, and then spoke in a quiet, flat tone that made my skin crawl. He asked me if I was traveling alone. The question felt wrong, not casual or polite, but probing, like he already knew the answer and wanted to hear me admit it. I nodded, paid quickly, and turned to leave, suddenly eager to put distance between myself and the station. As I reached the door, he spoke again, stopping me cold. He said almost casually that I shouldn't take the highway ahead, that there had been accidents there, too many to count. When I asked what kind of accidents, he just smiled, a slow, small smile that never reached his eyes, and said people sometimes went missing on that stretch of road. Then he added something that made my throat tighten. He said most of them stopped here first. I left without saying another word, my heart pounding as I got back into my car and pulled away from the pump. In the rearview mirror, I watched the station fade into the fog, the lights growing dimmer until they vanished completely. A few minutes later, I checked my fuel gauge out of habit. It still read nearly empty, as if I'd never stopped at all. When I glanced back at the mirror, just for a second, I could have sworn I saw the glow of those lights again behind me, much closer than they should have been, as if the gas station hadn't let me leave after all. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. I didn't intend to stop at the gas station. I barely noticed it at first, just a faint cluster of lights far off the road, partially hidden by tall trees and creeping fog. My GPS had already lost signal 20 minutes earlier, rerouting me onto narrow back roads that felt less like highways and more like forgotten paths no one maintained anymore. When my dashboard suddenly lit up with a low fuel warning, my stomach sank because I knew I didn't have much choice. I slowed down, signaled, and turned toward the lights, expecting nothing more than a quick refill before getting back on the road. The station looked wrong the moment I pulled in. It wasn't abandoned, not exactly, but it felt unkept in a way that suggested no one really worked there anymore. The sign above the building flickered irregularly, switching between open and nothing at all. One pump stood alone under the canopy, its paint chipped and rusted, while the others looked as though they hadn't been used in years. The fog pressed in tightly around the property, thick enough that I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the edge of the lot. As I stepped out of my car, the cold hit me immediately, sharper than the night air had been while driving. Every sound felt amplified. The crunch of gravel under my shoes, the soft whine of distant power lines, the faint ticking of my engine cooling down. There was no attendant in sight, but the pump lights were on, so I approached anyway and began refueling. That's when I noticed the building's windows. They were dark, completely black, like nothing inside reflected light at all. Halfway through filling my tank, I sensed movement behind me. It wasn't sound exactly, more like the feeling you get when someone stands too close without announcing themselves. I turned slowly, expecting to see an employee, but instead, there was another car parked behind mine, one I was certain hadn't been there moments earlier. Its headlights were off, its doors closed, and inside sat a driver, perfectly still. I couldn't make out their face, only a vague silhouette behind the windshield. I tried to wave, thinking maybe they were waiting for the pump, but they didn't react. They didn't move at all. The pump clicked loudly as it stopped, and the driver's door of that car creaked open on its own, inch by inch, far slower than anyone would open it naturally. That's when panic crept into my chest. I quickly replaced the nozzle and backed away, watching as a figure stepped out and stood upright beside the car. The lighting made their proportions seem off, elongated, stretched in a way that didn't feel human. Without thinking, I got back into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The moment my headlights came on, the figure vanished. The car behind me was gone too, leaving only empty fog and the faint glow of the gas station lights. My heart hammered as I pulled away, telling myself it had been exhaustion, shadows, tricks of late-night driving. A few minutes down the road, my radio crackled to life on its own, filling the cabin with static before settling on a faint voice. The voice sounded distant and distorted, but I could make out the words clearly enough. It asked if I needed fuel. I nearly swerved off the road. I shut the radio off completely, but the voice continued, now coming softly from the back seat, repeating the same question over and over. When I finally dared to look in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The gas station was behind me again, impossibly close, its lights bright and steady, as if I'd never left. Parked by the pump stood my car. The version in front of the station had its headlights off and its driver's door open. And standing beside it was me. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It was just after 2:30 in the morning when I pulled off the highway because my fuel light had been glowing for over 20 miles. And the only sign of civilization I had seen was a flickering green gas station sign standing alone at the edge of a forest that looked too dense for anything to be built near it. The station felt wrong immediately, not abandoned exactly, but outdated, like no one had cared enough to update it since the early 90s, with yellowed lights buzzing overhead, cracked concrete stained with oil, and a single pump sitting farthest from the building already covered in frost despite the mild temperature. I shut off my engine and sat there for a moment, listening, realizing how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that makes you aware you're being watched even when nothing is visible. And when I finally stepped out of the car, the air smelled stale, like metal and wet leaves that had been left to rot. The station door was propped open even though no one was inside, and as I walked closer, I noticed the clerk's counterlight was on, the register humming softly, and a radio playing faintly from somewhere behind the shelves, though no one responded when I called out. I began pumping gas, watching the numbers climb far slower than they should have, and that's when I noticed the reflection in my side mirror, a shape standing behind my car, just far enough away to blend with the shadows near the tree line. When I turned around, there was nothing there, but the feeling didn't leave, and I could swear the forest itself had grown closer, the trees appearing thicker and darker than they had just moments earlier. I went inside to pay, stepping onto a floor that creaked in a way old buildings usually don't, like the sound wasn't coming from the wood beneath my feet, but from somewhere much deeper. And behind the counter stood a man who hadn't been there before, his face pale under the humming light, eyes sunken and unfocused, staring just past me rather than at me. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't even blink as I placed the cash on the counter, and when he finally moved it felt delayed, like an old videotape catching up to the present, his hand sliding forward too slowly, brushing the money with fingers that felt unnaturally cold when they touched mine by accident. Without saying a word, he pointed toward the hallway leading to the restroom, and before I could ask why, the radio volume spiked suddenly, voices overlapping in static whispers that sounded almost like my name being repeated. I backed toward the door, my heart pounding harder than it should have, and that's when I saw something written on the counter in dust, words etched deep by countless fingerprints over time. "Don't turn around." The lights flickered, and in the glass reflection behind the clerk I saw shapes filling the store, figures standing between the shelves, some tall, some far too thin to be human, all facing me, while the man behind the counter remained perfectly still. I ran. I didn't even shut the car door properly as I jumped inside, slammed the engine to life and peeled back onto the highway, refusing to look in my mirrors until the gas station lights disappeared completely. It wasn't until 20 minutes later that I noticed my fuel gauge was still exactly where it had been before I stopped, and when I pulled over again to check, I found mud caked onto my tires, the kind you'd only find deep inside a forest. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched for the station online, only to find an old report about a fire decades ago, where several people had died after stopping late at night, their cars found empty on the highway nearby with no explanation of where they went. The gas station no longer existed on any map, and according to local records, it hadn't been standing for over 15 years. Yet even now, sometimes when I'm driving at night and my fuel light comes on, my radio flickers with static, and for just a moment, I can hear that same whisper cutting through the noise, calmly reminding me not to turn around. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. I had been driving for nearly 6 hours straight, trying to make it home before sunrise, when the rain began without warning, heavy enough to blur the road into a narrow tunnel of headlights and reflections. And by the time I noticed the warning sign for roadwork ahead, it was already too late to turn back. The detour led me off the main highway and onto a long, unlit stretch of road that seemed to snake endlessly through farmland, with no houses, no cell service, and no other cars in sight. Just the steady hum of tires on wet asphalt and the faint glow of my dashboard. After a while, I noticed headlights behind me, keeping a steady distance no matter how fast or slow I drove. Never overtaking but never falling back either. And something about the way they stayed perfectly centered in my mirror made my stomach tighten. I tried slowing down to let the car pass, but it didn't, and when I sped up, the headlights did too, always matching me like a shadow that refused to detach. Eventually, the road narrowed even more, forcing me to reduce my speed, and that's when the headlights suddenly vanished altogether, leaving me alone again in the darkness, surrounded by the sound of rain tapping sharply against the roof. Relieved but unsettled, I continued on until a flickering sign appeared ahead, advertising a gas station that didn't show up on my navigation, its lights dim and uneven, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. I pulled in, noticing only one pump was operational, and beside it stood an old sedan with its driver's door hanging open. Rain soaking into the empty interior as if whoever had stepped out never came back. The station itself looked occupied but lifeless, with lights on inside and a television glowing behind the counter, though the sound was muted. And as I stepped through the door, the bell rang loudly, echoing far longer than it should have. A woman stood behind the counter, motionless, staring at the screen with an expressionless face. Her reflection in the glass slightly delayed when she finally turned to look at me, like the movement didn't quite sync with reality. She asked where I was headed, her voice calm but flat, as if repeating something memorized long ago, and when I told her, she frowned slightly and said, "I shouldn't be driving tonight. Not on this road, not at this hour." Before I could ask what she meant, the power flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a second too long, and in that moment, I heard footsteps moving behind the shelves, slow and deliberate, circling closer with each step. The light snapped back on, the woman was gone, and the store looked emptier than before. Shelves half-stocked, dust layered thick like it hadn't been disturbed in years, despite the television still glowing silently. I backed toward the door, heart racing, when I noticed something scratched deeply into the glass by the entrance, words barely visible unless the light hit them right. "If you see the lights behind you again, don't stop." Outside, rain pooled unnaturally still around my tires, the old sedan now gone without a trace, and as I pulled back onto the road, my headlights swept across the trees just in time to catch shapes standing too close to the pavement, figures illuminated for seconds before dissolving back into shadow. That's when the headlights returned behind me, closer this time, so bright they flooded my mirrors with white light, and suddenly I understood why the warning mattered. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I drove until the sun began to rise and exhaustion forced me to pull over at a rest stop crowded with other travelers. When I finally checked my phone, notifications flooded in all at once, including a news alert about a closed road where multiple cars had been found abandoned overnight, engines cold, doors open, and no sign of where the drivers went. The location matched the road I had taken exactly. To this day, I avoid night drives whenever I can, because sometimes, when the rain hits just right and the road stretches too long ahead, I notice headlights in my mirror that stay perfectly centered, waiting for me to make a mistake. You've just crossed the boundary between reality and the unknown. If you felt the fear tonight, make sure to subscribe before you leave, because on this channel every story is just the beginning. New nightmares arrive every few nights, each one darker than the last. Until then, keep your lights low, your doors locked, and your mind open. You are now part of the FearBound family.